Welcome, Zion. We're looking forward to what you had to teach the children and us. Oh, you want the speaker?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm way too short for that.
There you go.
Hi, everybody.
You don't have to have it that close.
Yeah. Today I'm going to be reading Enemy Pie by Derek Munson and illustrated by Tara Callan King. I'm gonna read the words and then show the pictures because it'll be much easier. Here's Enemy Pie. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a treehouse in our backyard. My sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood, right next door to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me when he struck me out in a baseball game. He had a party on his trampoline, and I wasn't even invited. But my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved in the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, Dad understood stuff like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too. But he knew of a way to get rid of them. I asked him to tell me how. Tell you how? I'll show you how, he said. He pulled a really old recipe book off the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn out scrap of paper with faded writing. Dad I went alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof. I threw a boomerang that never came back to me. And all the while, I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping, stirring, and blending the ingredients of enemy pie. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it would look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something. I went in to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good. But Dad was smart. If enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it, he said. I could tell he made enemy pie before. The buzzer rang, and Dad put on the oven mitts and pulled the pie out of the oven. It looked like plain old pie. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out or their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was no help. He wouldn't tell me a thing. Why the pie could, he filled me on it, my job. He talked quietly. There's one part of enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend a day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him. It's not easy, but that's the only way the enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this? Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross. Then he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. I rode my bike to his house and knocked on the door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. Can you play? I asked. He looked for a while and laid water balloons and threw them at the neighborhood girls. But we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch. After lunch, it was strange, but I was kind of having fun with my enemy. He almost seemed nice, but of course I couldn't tell Dad that. See, I'd worked so hard. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he would have room for one. I let him win a game. Jeremy Rawson knew how to throw a boomerang. He came right back to him. I threw it over my house and into the backyard. To find it, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my tree house. Uh-oh. My treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her in. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him in. And if Jeremy wanted in, can we go in it? He asked. I knew he was going to ask me that. But he was at the top person, the only person on my enemy list. Okay, I said, but hold on. Gonna take this off. I climbed up ahead of him and tore the enemy list off the wall. I had a checkerboard and some cars in the treehouse, and we played dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but somehow he found us. Dad made us macaroni and cheese for dinner. My favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget about enemy pie. But sure enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut the pie into 8 thick slices. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a friend in a new neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention and trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy. But Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was just pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates, side by side, with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, looking at the pie. My dad never makes pies like this. It was at the point that I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat it. It's bad pie. I think it's poisonous or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled up his eyebrows and looked at me funny. I felt relieved. I had saved his life. I was a hero. If it's so bad, Jeremy asked, then why has your dad already eaten half of it? I turned to look at my dad. Sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled through a mouthful. And that was all he said. I sat there watching them eat enemy pie for a few seconds. Dad was laughing. Jeremy was happily eating, and neither of them was losing any hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste. Enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he'd teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or their breath turns bad. But I don't know if I'll ever get an answer, because I just lost my best enemy. My grandma made a game that say the opposite of what something is. So I'll say something and then someone will have to say the opposite. So I'll play it with you, Faith. So what do you think the opposite of hate is? Just do a guess. The opposite of hate is love. Now we'll try again. What do you think the opposite?
You
Anyone else want to take a guess? Yeah, my mom wrote warm though, which still kind of makes sense. Okay, what's the opposite of happy, Faith? Yep, that's it. Good job. Now, this one's kind of hard. What do you think the opposite of sunny would be? Anyone else want to take a guess? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking cloudy or foggy, but my mom wrote rainy. Yeah. Now, what's the opposite of old? Yeah, she said young or new. So I guess if you're talking about like a product or something, it'd be new.
Nice job, Grandma.
That's it.
Thank you, Zion. I don't know if Joanne's going to suggest that someone that hurt us, we were to go spend a day with them or not, but that's her suggestions. It sure worked, didn't it, Zion? That we share some of our offering for the work of the church. And we have our regular offering, which we will pass around with the basket. And then we have the children's offering for coins that you have or dollars, whatever. And that's for the school kids. So we'll start it over here and just pass it around.
Well, we're taking hymn number 759. Hymn number 759. We'll sing verses 1 and 4. Take my life and let it be. Take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee. Take my moments and my days, let them flow in ceaseless praise. Let them flow in ceaseless praise. Verse 4. Take my silver and my gold, not a mine of just withhold. Take my will and make it thine. It shall be no longer. It shall be no longer.
Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Oh God, our offering proclaims that work and worship are one, that life is undivided. Use these gifts for your church's ministry of reconciliation, service, and mercy. Amen. Hey, Joey, I think you're going to be sharing, and then at some point we'll invite Cal and I to read the scripture. So let me introduce you to Joanne Ditzel. She is our conference minister. We're a member of the Atlantic Coast Conference, have been a member for years. And Joanne, I think most of you know her as a spiritual leader. So we really appreciate her this morning. So, Joanne, welcome.
Good morning. I can't believe we're outside. When I left home this morning, it was raining. I think they were calling for 1 to 3 inches in that hour. It was pouring rain. The closer here, the brighter it got, and it's just so lovely to be outside. Really nice. I'm delighted to be here again. It's a beautiful drive down, and I always enjoy seeing familiar faces again. I'm going to begin by telling you a story. She asked each of her students to bring a clear plastic bag to school, along with a sack of potatoes. So the students, they did that. Okay, if I set it up here or not?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. No.
No.
How about here where the candle is? Yeah, that'll work. I'm just going to keep that sack of potatoes there for right now. And what she asked the students to do was to take a potato and to think about their life. Think about their enemy, as Zion talked about in his book, and to maybe they also become a little bit slimy. The teacher wanted her students to understand that without forgiveness, resentment, their hurt feelings, and their grudges, they carry it around like in a plastic bag. These kinds of things impact their lives as well as ours, and relationships when we hang on. Feelings or anger or hate. Don't get worried. I didn't bring you plastic bags this morning. Dave talked about this, and you can't quite. What are those situations or people that you are struggling with? Moments. Dave and Kyle, I'm going to ask you to come now and read the Romans text.
The scripture reading this morning is Romans 14, 1 to 12. Church. Most of his advice and encouragement is about upholding the oneness of sisters and brothers in Christ.
And yet for all of Paul's emphasis on the vitality of the church,
Welcome with open arms other believers the way you do.
and try not to jump on every other believer every time they do something or say something you don't agree with, even when it seems that they are strong on opinions but weak in the faith department.
Remember, treat others.
Let's look at some examples.
A person who has been around for a while might well be convinced that he or she can eat anything on the table.
Background and a sense.
That is why Jesus lived and died and then lived again.
Jesus wants to be our master.
Please the Lord and give thanks. Why Jesus lived and died and then lived again.
Of life and death, and free us from the petty ways we treat each other.
Live or die for ourselves. If we live, it is to honor the Lord.
If we die, it is to honor the Lord.
So whether we live or die, we belong to the Lord. So why do you condemn or criticize another brother or sister? I say this leaves us looking pretty silly, or worse.
To end up kneeling side by side, facing God.
A little bit. Remember what the scriptures say.
Humankind, that means all of us, were created in such a way that make differences and conflict very normal. That means all of us were created in such a way that make differences and conflict very normal and predictable. We are real people. We participate in real churches, and we have real differences and misunderstandings. And we hurt each other. The only lasting harm that comes from us or a church community is when we refuse to deal with the conflict or to deal with a grudge or a misunderstanding. Paul sees a crisis brewing within the congregation. There was trouble and potential for a split over what they should eat or when they should eat it. Whole segments of the church refused to have anything to do with each other. Can you imagine being on the kitchen committee? When we eat it is for honoring and pleasing the Lord. With everything and all that we've got, we are encouraged to build unity rather than pass judgment. Paul envisions Jews and Gentiles alike to be transformed together and giving glory to their God. In this setting in which we just heard, the groups were guilty of judging each other, both thinking that they were right, and they were judging each other's spirituality. Both of the group points, theologically and biblically, they each thought they were right. It seems that before we can begin to work at forgiveness, we have to understand the depth of God's forgiveness for each of us. God forgives us freely and often. Our willingness to forgive others rests in our awareness of God's deep love for us and our need for forgiveness. Any illusion that we may have that the others are sinful and we are perfect bursts like a balloon. Everyone stands in need of mercy. There are no exceptions to that. Recognizing God's forgiveness as a free gift helps to remove the barriers that we erect. Basic to our Christian life, it often doesn't seem like it makes much sense in the culture that we live in. We live in a culture of vengeance and payback. We live in a culture where we've become less accountable for our actions. A culture where we are more hostile with our words. A culture where we seem to care less about our enemies. A culture that lacks the energy from us, whether we realize the lack of potatoes. In the bottom, smells the food, slips his open hand, the neck of the jug, and closes it around the food. When he tries to withdraw his hand, the monkey isn't able to do so. So the hunters can walk up and capture the monkey because the monkey won't open his hand and let go. When we are hurt, we too want to hang. Revenge will bring satisfaction and power. Like the monkey with his hand in the jug, we think that by hanging on, we might get what we're after. I'm not here this morning to tell you that forgiving is easy. It's not. Forgiving is a difficult task, which is often why we turn away from it or bury it deep inside or just don't deal with it. Left unattended, unforgiveness can impact us emotionally, physically, and spiritually, much like the heaviness and the stench of these potatoes. John Paul Lederach, in his book Reconcile, writes this: when we are in conflict, we are not at our best. We have suspicions and we judge. We are not alternative interpretations. We do not easily offer a generous spirit. And to be very honest, it's not easy to look into the or wrong. To redirect our energy and move ahead when we are looking back at what hurt us. Dwelling on hurts keeps us from becoming the kind of people God intended us to be. We need to make a U-turn in our thoughts, our feelings, and behaviors. One of the things that I've learned over the years that sometimes the first thing I need to do is forgive myself. To begin with myself. Learning to forgive myself is rooted in the grace of forgiving others. Parts about ourselves that do and say things that just aren't acceptable. So can I offer grace to others when they too don't live up to my expectations? Jesus had this great capacity to forgive others. He sent people away feeling lighter and less burdened by their limitations. Jesus knew their faults, but he didn't reject them. Jesus knows our faults and doesn't reject us. We are only able to extend mercy and grace to others when we know and accept God's mercy and grace hurt us. Zion, your story this morning was such a great example of that. It fit perfect. We often realize that once we get to know people, they're not that we thought they were. And they're just human beings, wounded people who are struggling in the same way we are. But it takes time and it takes intention. And sometimes in our busy lives, we don't take the time to do that kind of hard work. I will also admit that there are times that I don't want to forgive. And I don't want to be nice. Do you know how they treated me? Do you know what they said? I want to hold on to this. I feel justified. And sometimes it's like, do you remember when we had small children or were small children? We had a blanket that was just our times. Those kinds of things we think we apology. And realizing much later that they never once thought about it. I was the one carrying all of it. Goes back to the need to let it go. Before over by a very domineering father, when she and Robert approval. After the wedding, the Brownings sailed for Italy, where they lived for lives. But even though her parents disowned her, Elizabeth never gave up on that relationship. Almost weekly, inside, Elizabeth found all of her letters, not one of them opened. Today, those letters are among the most beautiful in classic English literature. In Romans, Paul tells us that our ability to be a community, to be God's people, is often compromised by the grudges that we carry, because it demands that I let go of something that I value. My pride, my sense of justice, and sometimes my sense for revenge. We live in very divisive and difficult. We have had and have differences in how we responded to the pandemic. We have differences about whether to come to church, to participate virtually. We have differences about wearing masks and about getting the vaccine, but that's okay and normal that we gather with these different perspectives and ideas, because those are not the kinds of things that hold us together. It's Christ that holds us together. It's not about being right or wrong. It's not about our weaknesses and strengths. Each of us is a beloved child of God, and our faith calls us to dignity, honesty, and forgiveness. As followers of Christ, our mission is to bring restoration, recreation, and transformation to all people. We forgive so that we can look each other in the eye and live together. Through forgiveness, we remember that we belong to God. Grace. Instead of holding on, instead of carrying around a sack of potatoes, can we imagine sharing a bowl or book? Moving towards forgiveness writes, and I quote, "To forgive is to make a conscious choice to release the person who has wounded us from the sentence of our judgment, however justified that judgment might be. Our forgiveness represents a choice to leave behind our resentment and desire for retribution. Forgiveness involves excusing persons from the. You listen to the words of the Roman text, and as we've talked, when to deal with the potatoes that we carry around with us, we are acknowledging to God and to each other that we do not and we have not and do not each other the way we should. We acknowledge to God and each other that we've been hurt by others, that we sometimes despise others even to the point of hatred. Journey of letting go of past hurts. We acknowledge that forgiveness and reconciliation seem impossible for us, but we're willing to try. We acknowledge that we come seeking healing and forgiveness and wholeness can make us whole, transforming our weaknesses into strength. Whatever else Jesus might have envisioned for the church, the one thing he was clear about was that we could never be finished with the need to forgive each other. We forgive so that we can look each other in the eye and live together. See, such pardon and kindness I cannot fathom. Forgiveness is unfailing love. Such patience and understanding I can. Forgiveness is the blotting out of transgressions. Such freedom and good will I not deserve. Forgiveness is the washing away of my iniquities. Such purity not maintain. so good, whose love goes on forever. Amen.
Thank you, Joanne, for that challenging and inspiring message at contest. Then I thought, well, if Paul was to write us a letter, Hebron, what would he be concerned about as far as what he would say would be, if you're judgmental and critical, that will lead to division. If you're understanding and accepting and loving, that will lead to unity. So I hope we can practice that and remember approach is understanding and acceptance and love. And he's going to lead us in a responsive hymn.
For thy salvation be our glory adored.
People's anniversaries and birthdays. And Mary Martin is a privileged person, I guess. And we seek to understand and accept and love someone over.
Actually, I graduated at 17.
Gene?
Over the years, I have sort of assumed the responsibility for maintaining the flower bed or whatever it is under the sign. And when it would get too bad, then I would finally, I'd go feed and whatever. Unfortunately, I'm not able to do that right now. So I am imploring people to know this and do whatever they think.
Jean is asking for a volunteer for this summer since she can't get on her knees. Do the flower beds. Do we have someone that would volunteer to do that? Okay, thank you. Jennifer and Zion said they would do. I would suspect that Rhoda announced last week that the cherry tomatoes are in the garden there to help. Oh, they're already picked?
There's some over there on the table. There's more in the garden to be picked, so help yourselves.
Okay, other announcements. Ken, they were freshly picked this morning. Wilmer.
Elijah's adoption on the 30th.
Okay, Elijah, Matt, and Rodney's son will become officially adopted on the 30th. Oh, I'm sure you're just tickled pink. No other announcements. Kyle will lead us in